For months now, quiet tension has been building in the heart of the Baltic region. Kaliningrad, a small Russian enclave bordered by Poland and Lithuania, has become the center of a slow, methodical encirclement. On official maps, nothing dramatic has changed. No battles, no borders redrawn, no treaties signed. Yet, according to defense officials across Europe, the geography of security in the region has already shifted. "It's not about territory," said one diplomat in Brussels. "It's about presence. And presence these days is everywhere." Since Sweden's entry into NATO, the Baltic Sea has effectively turned into an internal alliance zone, a lake under shared surveillance. From the air, from the sea, and from the ground, every movement around Kaliningrad is being tracked, mapped, and archived. "It's the most monitored piece of land in Europe right now," one Western intelligence officer said. "Nothing enters or leaves unnoticed." For Moscow, this represents not only a strategic challenge, but a symbolic defeat. Kaliningrad was once the spearhead of Russian influence in Europe. Now it looks more like a stronghold surrounded by silent observers. Inside the enclave, the signs of strain are subtle but visible. Freight deliveries from mainland Russia arrive slower. Maritime routes face constant inspection, and energy supplies, once flowing smoothly through the Baltic, now move under restrictions. Officially, authorities describe the situation as controlled and temporary. Unofficially, residents speak of quiet unease. "It's like living in a house with all the doors open," said a local journalist. "You can still move, but you feel watched." NATO's posture, meanwhile, remains deliberate and measured. The alliance avoids direct confrontation, relying instead on constant readiness, joint patrols, routine flights, coordinated naval drills. "The goal is to maintain pressure without provocation," a military analyst in Stockholm explained. "You don't need escalation when you already have proximity." The strategy reflects a broader Western doctrine: containment through endurance. Each patrol, each radar ping, each exercise reinforces a sense of inevitability. The feeling that the encirclement is not temporary, but structural. In Moscow, the reaction oscillates between defiance and restraint. Officials denounce NATO's aggressive expansion, yet avoid direct military gestures. Analysts interpret this as a sign of strategic exhaustion. "They can't escalate," said a former diplomat. "They can only declare." The rhetoric grows sharper as the options narrow. State media presents the situation as a Western provocation, a test of Russian patience. But behind the slogans, even loyal commentators admit the difficulty of response. "They are boxed in," one said quietly. "Geographically, politically, and psychologically." International observers describe the situation as a cold conflict without the cold. There are no missile exchanges, no visible confrontations, only a permanent readiness that drains both sides over time. "The danger," explained a European security expert, "is not that someone fires. It's that everyone forgets how close they are. The longer the standoff lasts, the more normalized it becomes. Military presence turns into routine, tension turns into background noise." "This is the new normal," said a defense attaché in Warsaw. "A conflict that doesn't begin, and therefore never ends." Economically, Kaliningrad remains vulnerable. The sanctions imposed on Russia after its full-scale invasion of Ukraine have already disrupted supply chains. Now, the geographic isolation magnifies the effect. Prices rise quietly, imports shrink, and the once busy transit corridors through Lithuania face increasing scrutiny. Local industries, from shipping to manufacturing, rely on improvisation, rerouting through sea or air, each option slower and more expensive. "It's like trying to breathe through a straw," said one logistics operator. "You still can, but not for long." For NATO, however, this situation is not simply about Kaliningrad. It is about the principle of deterrence, demonstrating that the alliance can sustain pressure indefinitely without crossing the threshold into war. "The goal isn't to defeat Russia militarily," said a senior official in Brussels. "It's to redefine the boundaries of its influence." Kaliningrad, with its mix of military bases and civilian population, becomes the perfect laboratory for that doctrine. Every truck delayed, every flight rerouted, every broadcast monitored serves as proof that control can be exercised without confrontation. Inside Russia, the story told is different. State television presents the enclave as the shield of the West, an outpost defending the motherland against encirclement. The narrative appeals to patriotism, but also to nostalgia, the idea that isolation equals purity and siege equals strength. "They're trying to turn containment into heroism," said a media analyst in Moscow. "It's a way to survive the humiliation." Yet for many in Kaliningrad, this transformation feels hollow. "We're not heroes," said a teacher. "We're just cut off." And so the region stands, connected but constrained, calm but compressed. The new flashpoint in Europe is not a battlefield, but a pressure point where diplomacy, geography, and endurance converge. No one expects the situation to explode. Everyone knows it could. The real tension, a European strategist said, is not in the noise. It's in the silence. For those who want to follow how this silent confrontation reshapes Europe's balance of power, how encirclement becomes policy, and how pressure turns into permanence, subscribing will keep you connected to the deeper layers behind the headlines, where the next crisis is already unfolding quietly. Inside Kaliningrad, the pressure of encirclement has begun to transform daily life. There are no explosions, no sudden shocks, only small, cumulative absences that together redraw the outline of normality. Certain goods appear less often on store shelves, transport schedules shift without explanation, and bureaucratic language fills the silence. Temporary disruptions, officials call them, routine adjustments. But people notice patterns that officials refuse to name. Every month, a resident said, something disappears. Not completely, just enough to remind you that it can. The most visible change lies in the rhythm of logistics. Trains that once crossed Lithuania in a day now take 3. Fuel deliveries arrive under escort, and commercial flights are rerouted or delayed due to coordination procedures. None of these obstacles is catastrophic, but their accumulation creates an invisible border. "You realize that the map hasn't changed?" a journalist noted. "Only the meaning of distance." In practical terms, Kaliningrad remains part of Russia. In psychological terms, it feels farther away every week. The regional government follows Moscow's script with careful precision. Local leaders speak of resilience, self-sufficiency, and the spirit of the frontier. State media broadcast stories about volunteers helping to strengthen internal supply chains, and new initiatives appear daily. Buy local, grow your own, Baltic pride. The language is optimistic, the tone unwavering, yet between the lines there is an undertone of managed desperation. "They talk about resilience," a business owner said, "because they can't promise relief." For the population, the adjustment has become instinctive. People plan trips around availability, stock fuel when possible, and measure time in delivery cycles. Students joke about logistics weeks, the periods when fresh goods finally reach the stores. Some find comfort in routine, others turn to cynicism. "We live like it's normal," said a taxi driver, "because it's easier than admitting it's not." The quiet humor masks a deeper fatigue, one shared across generations. Older residents recall Soviet shortages. Younger ones grew up with open borders. Now both generations meet in the same line at the same half-empty station, waiting for a train that may or may not come. Moscow's position remains ambiguous. The Kremlin publicly insists that Kaliningrad is under reliable protection. Yet privately, officials acknowledge that sustaining the enclave has become a logistical and political burden. The Baltic Sea, once a corridor of projection, now feels like a moat. Every delivery, every shipment, every conversation has to pass through someone else's gate, said a Russian economist. Control has moved outward. To offset this dependence, Moscow invests in grand gestures, infrastructure projects, symbolic visits, declarations of unity. The gestures work domestically, but less so within the region. "They build bridges on television," one resident said. "But we need roads that actually connect." On the international stage, the encirclement has become a symbol of containment done right. European defense circles quietly praise the outcome: deterrence without conflict, isolation without escalation. "It's a victory of patience," a Western strategist said. "You don't defeat an army, you surround its supply lines with time." The success has encouraged similar thinking across other border zones, where control is measured not in territory gained, but in pressure sustained. Kaliningrad, in this context, is both precedent and experiment. Yet even experiments have human costs. The region's younger population faces a new reality: limited travel opportunities, shrinking job markets, and growing surveillance. "You start to feel like an extra in someone else's film," said a university student. "We're here, but not part of the story." Civil organizations attempt to maintain morale through cultural events and local initiatives, but the energy feels manufactured. The state organizes festivals, the church holds vigils, the media praises patriotism. "It's a performance of calm," a sociologist observed. "The more they perform it, the less it feels real." For NATO, the situation represents a test of strategic restraint. Military activity remains constant. radar sweeps, patrols, exercises, but the alliance avoids direct engagement. The best outcome, said a Swedish analyst, is no outcome at all. The aim is to let the pressure normalize, to turn vigilance into background noise. Every day that passes without confrontation strengthens the logic of containment. It's the politics of stillness, explained a European diplomat. You achieve stability by refusing movement. Inside Russia, that stillness is interpreted differently. State outlets describe it as proof that the West has failed to provoke a response. But independent analysts see something else: paralysis disguised as prudence. They're proud of not reacting, said a political observer, because they've forgotten how to act. The longer the encirclement endures, the more the Kremlin relies on symbolism over substance. Kaliningrad is strong, the headlines declare. But strength, in this context, has come to mean silence. Among ordinary citizens, silence has become the safest form of participation. Conversations about shortages fade into small talk. Criticism shifts to coded phrases. It's complicated. We manage. Things take time. The vocabulary of adaptation replaces that of dissent. No one believes the official version, said a retired teacher, but no one contradicts it either. We've learned to live between the lines. As the months pass, Kaliningrad's isolation begins to feel less like an emergency and more like geography, a fixed feature of life. Children grow up under the hum of surveillance planes. Adults schedule their days around scarcity. The border that divides East and West is no longer a line, it is a condition. And within that condition, the region has learned the quiet art of survival, without resistance, without protest, without choice. In Moscow, the encirclement of Kaliningrad has turned into a mirror reflecting the limits of power. The official position remains confident. The region is secure, and all logistics are under control. Yet behind the carefully crafted statements, unease is growing. Senior officials privately admit that the situation has entered what one described as a stage of managed stagnation. Nothing collapses, but nothing improves. Each week brings the same reports, the same reassurances, the same instructions to avoid speculation. They don't want solutions, said a government source. They want quiet. That quiet, however, comes at a cost. Ministries overlap in their responsibilities. Defense monitors supply routes. Transport negotiates new shipping schedules. Energy manages fuel distribution. Every agency insists it has control, but together they create a system where control becomes circular. Everyone reports stability, a logistics expert explained, because instability would mean accountability. The result is a fragile equilibrium held together by language. As long as they can call it stability, it exists, a political scientist in Moscow remarked. The moment they name it isolation, it doesn't. The propaganda machine sustains that illusion with practiced precision. News segments from Kaliningrad show smiling dock workers, busy ports, and children painting patriotic slogans under bright flags. The message is clear: life continues as usual. But independent observers describe a different reality: long queues at gas stations, declining trade, and shortages of imported medicine. They film the one store that's full, said a local resident. They don't show the rest. The gap between narrative and experience widens, yet the population learns to navigate it quietly. You don't contradict, a teacher said. You just don't repeat. In the corridors of power, the topic has become taboo. Officials prefer to discuss energy diversification or regional resilience, never the siege itself. No one wants to admit we're trapped, said a mid-level bureaucrat. So they rename the trap. The tactic works internally, but fails externally. European diplomats, watching from Brussels and Stockholm, note that Moscow's denial has become predictable. They're not reacting, said one envoy. They're rehearsing. The repetition itself is revealing, a performance of control designed to conceal paralysis. Meanwhile, NATO's posture remains patient. The alliance has discovered that inaction, sustained over time, can be its most effective weapon. The strategy is minimalism, said a Scandinavian defense official. We do less, and it costs them more. The pattern is deliberate: steady patrols, continuous observation, no surprises. Every movement is predictable by design, allowing Western forces to maintain pressure without risk. This is deterrence by consistency, explained a retired general. Predictability becomes control. For Russia, predictability feels like suffocation. They can't provoke us if we don't react, one official said proudly, but the absence of reaction has begun to erode confidence from within. Generals question whether deterrence still serves its purpose. Economists warn that sustaining Kaliningrad's isolation costs more than it yields, and regional administrators complain of shortages that never reach national reports. It's not rebellion, said a policy analyst. It's fatigue, a quiet recognition that the system runs on delay. Among citizens, fatigue manifests as adaptation. The people of Kaliningrad have learned to read between contradictions, to trust neither the alarm of Western headlines nor the calm of domestic news. We know both sides are lying, said a journalist. The truth is in the middle, but the middle keeps moving. This disorientation has become a feature of life. Teachers encourage critical optimism, parents teach their children not to ask too much, and local media carefully balance patriotism with practicality. They've mastered the language of half-truths, a sociologist explained. It's how you survive in a system built on performance. In Europe, the mood has shifted from anxiety to observation. The initial fear of escalation has been replaced by a quiet satisfaction. The encirclement works, not as an act of aggression, but as a policy of endurance. They built walls of transparency, said a defense researcher. Everything is visible, therefore nothing is allowed to move. The Baltic has become a model for non-violent containment, an experiment in geopolitical management through presence. This is not the Cold War, a diplomat in Berlin said. This is the cold quiet. Yet experts warn that such silence carries risks of its own. A system that depends on stillness eventually forgets how to move, explained a European analyst. And when it does move, it doesn't know where. For now, both sides remain locked in the choreography of non-escalation, a dance that costs energy but produces no change. They keep circling, said a senior strategist, but the circle itself has become the point. Inside Russia, that circle has started to feel familiar. It mirrors the broader reality of the state, stable on paper, stagnant in motion. Kaliningrad is no longer just a region, it's a metaphor for governance. Isolated, enduring, suspended between denial and dependency. It's Russia in miniature, said a political commentator. Contained from outside, constrained from within. The tragedy lies not in the siege itself, but in its acceptance. When you live surrounded long enough, one resident said, you stop noticing the walls. And perhaps that is the real danger. Not war, but normalization. The quietness becomes identity. The waiting becomes purpose. They tell us it's temporary, said a student, but so was everything else. For those who want to follow how this new balance of silence evolves, how a country learns to call containment stability, how patience replaces policy, and how the illusion of control hardens into fact, subscribing will keep you connected to the deeper analysis that looks beyond the noise, tracing the shape of a world that changes precisely because it no longer moves. As the months pass, what began as a tense standoff around Kaliningrad has evolved into a new form of equilibrium, one that both sides pretend not to recognize, but quietly depend on. The Baltic, once described as a potential trigger point for Europe's next conflict, now functions as a carefully managed pressure valve. No one fires, no one withdraws, and everyone watches. It's not stability, said a senior European diplomat. It's balance by exhaustion. In Brussels, policymakers have grown accustomed to the phrase strategic patience. It has become the mantra of the alliance's northern flank. Every action, a naval patrol, a logistics inspection, a new satellite image, serves to remind Moscow of its isolation without forcing it into confrontation. We're not trying to provoke, said a NATO official. We're proving that we can wait. This patience has turned into a doctrine, containment through permanence. Over time, the method has produced something that looks like control. Not loud, not triumphant, but consistent. The European Union, initially cautious about deep involvement in military posturing, has found a role in the slow, economic dimension of the siege. New trade corridors bypass Russian supply routes entirely. Baltic ports, once dependent on Russian traffic, now handle Western shipments instead. They've re-engineered geography, explained an economist in Copenhagen. The isolation of one region has redrawn the map for everyone else. Even as officials deny that Kaliningrad is under any kind of blockade, infrastructure tells another story. The lines that once connected it to Europe now curve around it, leaving the enclave not cut off, but irrelevant. For Moscow, irrelevance is the most dangerous outcome. The Kremlin can endure hostility, but not invisibility. They built their politics on resistance, said a Russian foreign policy scholar. But it's hard to resist something that no longer reacts. In the past, tension brought purpose. Now, silence brings exposure. Each time the government announces a victory, it feels smaller, more local, less believed. The system, designed for confrontation, struggles to function without it. They need pressure to define themselves, observed a Western analyst. Without enemies, the narrative collapses. Within Russia's elite, divisions have begun to show. Some argue for new diplomatic overtures to Europe, others demand stronger militarization of the enclave. Neither faction prevails. They all agree on one thing, said a source close to the Security Council. Nothing should change too quickly. The paralysis is deliberate. Movement risks revealing how little real leverage remains. As long as nothing happens, a senior official explained, we can claim control. This logic extends across the entire state apparatus. Control defined not by what is achieved, but by what is avoided. Meanwhile, the international conversation around Kaliningrad has shifted. What once filled headlines now occupies footnotes in reports about long-term regional adjustments. The lack of escalation has been rebranded as success. It's the quiet victory no one celebrates, said a European defense advisor. The crisis has been absorbed into Europe's broader landscape of managed tension, alongside frozen conflicts, prolonged sanctions, and half-implemented treaties. This is the future of confrontation, noted a policy expert in Berlin. Low noise, high maintenance. Outside Europe, the muted standoff has not gone unnoticed. In Beijing, analysts study Kaliningrad as a case study in what they call strategic encirclement without contact. Chinese state think tanks publish papers examining how the West's patience achieved what decades of sanctions and diplomacy could not. A contained adversary still formally intact, but functionally constrained. They are learning from it, said a U.S. intelligence officer. Not about Russia, about endurance as a tool. For China, the lesson is that dominance no longer requires expansion. It requires stillness, calibrated pressure, and the ability to hold a system in suspension. For smaller European states, the Kaliningrad experience has become both reassurance and warning. On one hand, it demonstrates that the alliance can contain Russia without direct conflict. On the other, it reveals how fragile such containment truly is. All it takes is one mistake, warned a Baltic security official. One exercise too close, one radar misreading, one overreaction. The longer the siege continues, the more normalized it becomes, and the more dangerous that normalization grows. When nothing happens for too long, a diplomat in Warsaw said, people stop believing that it can. In Kaliningrad itself, daily life mirrors this wider stagnation. The port cranes move slower, the warehouses stand half-empty, the factories hum at half-power. The city has adapted to its reduced pulse. Officials emphasize self-reliance, citizens emphasize endurance. It's not suffering, said a sociologist. It's anesthesia. The region no longer measures time in years, but in shipments, in shortages, in waiting. The siege has become not an event, but a climate, an atmosphere that defines how people live and think. You stop asking what changed, one resident said. You start asking what hasn't. The West calls this containment. Russia calls it encirclement. Both are right. Each side sees in Kaliningrad what it wants to see, either a quiet success of restraint or a quiet humiliation of endurance. The truth lies somewhere in between, in the shared recognition that this frozen balance serves both sides better than uncertainty. It's not peace, said a Swedish analyst. It's management. And management in this context has become ideology. Europe manages pressure. Russia manages perception. Each insists that the status quo is strategic, when in fact it is simply the path of least resistance. Yet within this fragile stillness lies something unprecedented, a form of conflict without movement, a siege without siege engines, a balance sustained entirely by repetition. Kaliningrad has become the blueprint for a new kind of confrontation, one that values control over victory, visibility over progress, and silence over noise. It's the perfect stalemate, said a Western diplomat. Everyone's waiting for a change they secretly hope will never come. Over time, the siege of Kaliningrad stopped being news and became a metaphor. What began as a border standoff between Russia and NATO has turned into a quiet study in how the modern world manages power, not through explosions, but through endurance. The tanks and warships still exist, but their purpose has changed. They no longer serve to fight, they serve to wait. It's not the Cold War anymore, said a European strategist. It's the still war. The stillness has its own rhythm. Every side moves carefully, predictably, and endlessly. NATO continues to monitor the enclave. Russia continues to insist on sovereignty. Diplomats continue to meet and declare that the situation is under control. The repetition creates its own illusion of safety. The longer nothing happens, explained a political scientist in Helsinki, the more everyone believes that nothing ever will. But behind the calm surface, fatigue deepens, political, economic, psychological. A crisis that doesn't explode, doesn't disappear, it seeps. In Kaliningrad, the seepage is visible in daily life. The isolation no longer shocks, it defines. We used to count days, a resident said. Now we count deliveries. The supply chains, once temporary workarounds, have become permanent detours. People have stopped expecting reconnection. We're used to being far, another resident added. The only thing that changes is how far feels. The adaptation has been so complete that even hardship feels manageable. Not because it's solved, but because it's predictable. You can live with anything, said a sociologist, as long as it happens slowly. For Russia, this slow erosion has produced a strange kind of victory, a survival without movement. The government points to Kaliningrad as proof of resilience, of strength under pressure. But that strength is static, built on repetition rather than recovery. They've learned to mistake endurance for progress, said a Moscow economist. It's like celebrating the absence of collapse. The illusion of control remains, but it costs more each year to maintain. The budget grows heavier, the logistics more complex, the faith thinner. Yet to admit the cost would mean acknowledging the limits of power. It's cheaper to believe, one official said quietly. For NATO, the success of containment has created a paradox of its own. The encirclement works too well. It demonstrates that the West can hold a position indefinitely, but not advance beyond it. We've built a structure we can't dismantle, a European diplomat admitted. If we move, we risk breaking the balance. If we stay, we freeze it forever. The Baltic region has become a museum of control, each side guarding a display case that no one can open. Peace by paralysis, said an analyst in Berlin. It's efficient, but it's empty. Observers outside the region see in Kaliningrad a preview of something larger, a model of the world to come. Power no longer expands, it circulates. Conflict no longer burns, it simmers. The most important battles are fought through supply chains, information, and endurance. The 21st century will not be about conquest, a strategist in Washington said. It will be about maintenance. Kaliningrad, in this sense, is not an exception. It is a prototype. The first fully managed confrontation where no one wins and no one dares to stop playing. Within the enclave, people understand this intuitively. They have learned to navigate the layers of silence, the silence of fear, the silence of habit, the silence of understanding. It's quiet, said a journalist, but not peaceful. That distinction perhaps defines the new era more than any treaty or headline. Peace used to mean the absence of war. Now it means the absence of surprise. We're safe, a resident added. We just don't know what that means anymore. In Moscow, the subject has faded from speeches. Officials no longer speak of Kaliningrad as a fortress, but as a stable region. The phrase sounds bureaucratic, but its subtext is clear. They have accepted the isolation. It's no longer a wound to be healed, but a scar to be managed. They've institutionalized containment, said a political observer. It's the only way to make it bearable. The West, too, has learned to live with the status quo. Sanctions continue, patrols continue, statements continue. The siege persists not because anyone wants it to, but because no one knows what to replace it with. The longer it lasts, the more it feels like a mirror. Kaliningrad reflects both sides, Russia's refusal to change and the West's inability to finish. It's a perfect symbol, said a diplomat in Brussels. Everyone sees what they want to see, and no one can touch it. The reflection extends beyond geopolitics into something deeper, a shared dependence on inertia. The age of movement, it seems, has ended. What remains is the management of stillness. Kaliningrad stands as both warning and precedent. It shows how easily the machinery of modern politics can transform uncertainty into system, how silence can become a policy, how waiting can replace strategy, how stability can be indistinguishable from stagnation. The world watches, not because it expects a breakthrough, but because it senses recognition. We are all becoming Kaliningrad, said a European analyst, surrounded by our own systems, convinced that stillness is control. And for those who want to understand how this quiet revolution in power continues, how nations learn to rule through time instead of force, and how conflict survives without sound, subscribing will keep you connected to the deeper analysis that follows these invisible wars of endurance, where history no longer moves, it simply persists.